Good morning. If you could open up your Bibles with me to Daniel chapter 5. Daniel chapter 5. As Pastor Brandon mentioned, he's been ready for today's passage for weeks. However, when it comes to preaching, it can be exhausting. And the reason for that is because you spend so much time preparing and studying to deliver something, and even while you're delivering it, there is an aspect of spiritual warfare after which you can't really explain it, but when you're done, you're like exhausted. And so there's two things there's nothing worse than. There's nothing worse than spending 40 or more hours preparing a sermon, getting it all written out, and then you can't deliver it. So Pastor Brandon was like, I don't want that to happen to me. So I'm going to push it back till next week so that doesn't happen, because I've already spent the time and the effort. In combination with that, right, Pastor Brandon has been under it emotionally this week, and he's like, I don't know if I have the ability, right, to go to spiritual warfare this Sunday. And I was like, don't worry about it. I got you. At the same time, I didn't want to go too far off the beaten path, right, because we've been in the book of Matthew. And so my goal for this morning was to provide some historical context as well as some human nature insight into some of the things that we've observed in the book of Matthew. And by historical context, a few weeks ago, we saw one of the confrontations that Jesus had with the religious leaders, and he even told them, he said, the Old Testament has told you, you've already read, if you've read in the scriptures and are familiar with the scriptures, you know that when the Son of Man comes, that the builders will reject the chief cornerstone. And he refers to two Old Testament realities in that passage, where number one, he's referring to a messianic psalm which directly states that the stones which the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. But he's also alluding to Daniel and Daniel's prophecies about how one day there will be a cornerstone hewn out, not from human hands, which will come and it will be hurled at the kingdoms of man, and the kingdoms of man will ultimately be destroyed. And the religious leaders would have understood that, because the origination of the term Son of Man comes from the book of Daniel, and it is specifically reserved for the Messiah and Messiah's role of restoring the kingdom of God, reinstituting the nation of Israel, and destroying the kingdom of men. Simultaneously, so that's my thought process about why Daniel chapter 5, because we didn't want to go too far off the beaten path either. But how many of you guys have also ever done something, and after you did it, you thought to yourself, I should have known better? Anybody ever done that? I remember a particular time. If any of you, I don't think any of you have actually ever met him, but my younger brother, I have two younger brothers, but the one that's immediately younger than me is very manipulative, and he loves, there's something, I don't know why, but it's almost like there's nothing that he enjoys more in the world than getting a rise out of people. I remember growing up, and whether or not it was true or false, sometimes it was true, sometimes it was false, but there were times where he would run to my mom, say that I was doing something to him, whether or not it was true. Sometimes it was true, sometimes it wasn't, because I'm not always innocent. But then she would come and confront me about it, and he would stand behind her and literally make a face like this. Got you. So there was this particular time, I literally do not remember what he said, what the situation was, but I remember being in our living room, and he said something very specific to me that I really did not like. And I don't remember what it was, because of what comes afterwards. I forget what came before. But he said it, and he was particularly proud of himself, because he saw that what he said to me got me really upset with him. And so the look on his face was like, got him. And he was really proud of himself. And to express the pride that he had in himself, he jumped up to hit the door frame that was right in front of me. I don't know why he did that, but he did. And the second he went airborne, I made a fist, punched him right in the gut. But since he was airborne, he flew backwards. And thankfully, praise the Lord, we had a coffee table in the living room. And he fell backwards and hit his head on the coffee table. But I say praise the Lord for that, because behind the coffee table, we had a brick hearth. And the second that his head hit that coffee table, I thought to myself, he's probably hurt. But thank the Lord, he's probably not dead. Because if that coffee table wasn't there, he might be. And in that moment, I thought to myself, yikes, I know what kind of things that he likes to do. I know that he likes to antagonize, and despite all of that, I should have known better. And if there was a plaque that you could put above Daniel chapter 5, it is this: Belshazzar, you should have known better. And the reason he should have known better is because Belshazzar was probably just 2 generations removed from King Nebuchadnezzar. And King Nebuchadnezzar, we see him come on the scene in Daniel chapter 1, and he comes in and he destroys Jerusalem. He takes captive the people of Judah, and he brings them back to Babylon. In Daniel chapter 2, we see that this king, Nebuchadnezzar, has a dream. And in his dream, there is a image. And that image has a golden head. And it is followed by, as you get towards the feet, that golden-headed image, as it gets down to the feet, the elements of that image get weaker and weaker. There's iron, there's clay, and eventually at the bottom, I think at the bottom it's clay. And the strongest element is at the top, and as you get down to the bottom is the weakest element. And he doesn't know what this means. And so he searches the kingdom, eventually finds Daniel, and Daniel comes and interprets the dream for King Nebuchadnezzar and reveals to him that, hey, these sections of the image itself represents the kingdoms of men, and the different elements within the image represents the different strengths of those kingdoms. And the golden head is your kingdom, but eventually your kingdom will be overtaken by a weaker kingdom, so on and so forth, until the Son of Man, until that chief cornerstone, which is not hewn from human hands, is cast by God from heaven and crushes the entire kingdom of man, crushes the system of man, and reinstitutes his own. And so that dream from God should have been a lesson in humility. But then we get to Daniel chapter 3, and what does King Nebuchadnezzar do? He goes, this is pretty cool. There are going to be kingdoms, but none of them are going to be stronger than mine. I'm the golden head. And so he crafts a golden image in celebration of that fact, and he calls all the people together, and he gets all his musicians, and he says, listen, my kingdom might be defeated one day, but of all the kingdoms, mine is the golden head. And so when you hear the music that I command to be played, you ought to bow down and you ought to worship this image. Now, we don't really know what the image was, but one thing we can be sure of is it represents his pride, and it represents his belief in the fact that he's the one that built the kingdom that he was in charge of. Well, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they refuse to bow down to this image, and Nebuchadnezzar is humbled. He is humbled by the fact that they do not die when he throws them into the fiery furnace, which was their judgment. But yet, in Daniel chapter 4, we see that King Nebuchadnezzar goes out and he is proud of his kingdom once again. And so God makes him to be like a beast of the field, where he wanders like a wild animal for 7 years. Eventually he comes to himself. And by the end of Daniel chapter 4, he comes back to himself and he declares that God is the only God and there is no God besides him. Then the very next chapter is Belshazzar. Right after the narrative of Nebuchadnezzar's humiliation comes the story of Belshazzar. And Belshazzar only appears in one book of the Bible. He's like a breath. Like as fast as he comes on the scene, he's gone. And he appears in Daniel chapter 5. And if King Nebuchadnezzar's role is to show us the patience of God in communicating to man that God is the one that is in charge, and whatever you have is given to you from God. If King Nebuchadnezzar represents the patience of God, then King Belshazzar is also an illustration of God's judgment on those that refuse to listen to God's warnings. He illustrates the sovereignty of God and his absolute authority, not just to place kings in their roles, just like King Nebuchadnezzar was placed in his role by God, but he also represents that God also has the authority to tear down kings as well. And so this illustration is made even more drastic by the fact that Belshazzar both appears and disappears within one single chapter. And he is portrayed to us as if he rose to power and then, due to his foolish actions, quickly fell to ruin. And in the book of Daniel, Belshazzar is in contrast to Nebuchadnezzar, whereas Nebuchadnezzar was dealt with patience, Belshazzar is not. And Belshazzar represents what Proverbs portrays to us is the perfect picture of a fool. Proverbs chapter 6 and verse 15 says, "Therefore his calamity shall come suddenly, suddenly he shall be broken and without remedy." That the description of a fool is someone that knows what to do but refuses to do it. And the end result of being foolish is exactly what Proverbs 6:15 says, that his end shall come suddenly and without remedy. And so let's turn our attention to Daniel chapter 5, where we see all of this play out. Starting in verse 1 of Daniel chapter 5, it says, "Belshazzar the king made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in the presence of the household. And while he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave the command to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple, which had been in Jerusalem, that the king and his lords and his wives and his concubines might drink from them. And then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken from the temple of the house of God, which had been taken in Jerusalem. And the king and his lords and his wives and his concubines drank from them, and they drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver and bronze and iron and wood and stone. And in the same hour, the fingers of a man's hand appeared and wrote opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. And then the king's countenance changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his hips were loosened and his knees knocked against one another. And the king cried aloud to bring the astrologers, the Chaldeans, the soothsayers, I've just lost my spot. Whoever reads his writing and tells me his interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck, and he shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Now all the king's wise men came, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king its interpretation. Then King Belshazzar was greatly troubled, and his countenance was changed, and his lords were astonished. And the queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came to the banquet table, and the queen spoke, saying, "O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts trouble you, nor let your countenance change. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the Spirit of God, and in the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father, the king, made him the chief of the magicians, astrologers, and Chaldeans, and soothsayers, inasmuch as an excellent spirit, knowledge, understanding, interpreting dreams, solving riddles, and explaining enigmas were found in Daniel, whom the king named Belshazzar, or Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will give him the interpretation." So we've all heard the expression from G.W.E. Wells when he, who is a historian, wrote that if there's anything we learn from history, it's that we don't learn from history. And that is exactly what we see in the life of Belshazzar. Although it's probably more pessimistic than we should be to paint all of humanity in this light, to say, you know what, no one learns from history. That can definitely be applied to Belshazzar. As we've already seen, Belshazzar knew of all of the things that had already happened to King Nebuchadnezzar, all the communication that God had with King Nebuchadnezzar, and yet King Belshazzar, in contrast to finding humility like Nebuchadnezzar did, knew of all those things, and he goes out and he makes a banquet from himself. Now we know from history that Belshazzar was not the direct son of Nebuchadnezzar, but he was likely just 2 generations removed. And in keeping with the traditions of the Middle East, because he descended from the line of Nebuchadnezzar, he was close enough related to be called the son of Nebuchadnezzar. And Belshazzar, as we've already seen, was a fool. We also see a description of a fool in Proverbs 1, chapter 7, where it says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. And that is where God brought Nebuchadnezzar to. He took Nebuchadnezzar in all of his pride, and he brought him to a place of fearing the Lord. And although Belshazzar should have taken the lessons of Nebuchadnezzar and put them into practice, instead, he lifts himself up as a god. And so Proverbs 1:7 says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. So Daniel chapter 5 doesn't even tell us anything about Belshazzar's reign. Doesn't tell us anything about his policies. Doesn't tell us anything about his greatness. The only thing that we know, actually for a matter of fact, historians for a long time tried to criticize the Bible, saying that this king Belshazzar never even existed. Now, archaeologists eventually found evidence in the records, in the archaeological records, that there were very small mentions of this king Belshazzar. And it's as if this king Belshazzar, who thought he was the best king of all time, ironically, according to history, we know nothing about him except for his destruction. This is the first record that history has found reserved. It's not the last, but it is the first one. And it is not a record of Belshazzar's greatness. It is a record of Belshazzar's last hours before whatever he did during his reign comes to a screaming, screeching halt. And during his last hours, while he was uncorking the wine bottle, outside of the city, the Medes and the Persians were busy. They were busy infiltrating Babylon. And while his enemies were outside the wall, currently infiltrating Babylon, he made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords, and he drank wine in the presence of the 1,000. And in all of his extravagance, Belshazzar seems to have the same attitude of the fool that we see in Luke chapter 12. In Luke chapter 12, Jesus tells the story of a rich fool. And in telling the story, Jesus said, then he spoke a parable to them, saying, the ground of a certain rich man yielded plentifully. And he thought within himself, saying, what shall I do, since I have no room to store my crops? So he said, I will do this. I will pull down my barns, I will build greater, and there I will store my crops and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have many goods laid up for many years. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, fool, this night your soul will be required of you. Then whose will those things be which you have provided? So is he who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich towards God. Then he said to his disciples, therefore I say to you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, nor about your body, what you will put on. And so Belshazzar had all he could desire and more. According to that time period, he had the greatest wall. He had the greatest riches. He had the greatest of all things. But yet, while his own city was under attack, and he might have known it, he thought to himself, I am impenetrable. I am the great King Belshazzar. And so while my enemies are attacking me, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to call all my lords to myself. I'm going to show off my wives and my concubines, and together we will drink and we will praise the Babylonian gods. Belshazzar was so secure in himself that he had no respect for God nor the things of God. And in his hubris, while his city was under attack, he did what even Nebuchadnezzar, in all of his pride, would have never imagined doing. He sent his servants to go and to grab the vessels from the temple of God to bring them to himself into his dining hall with his lords and his wives and his concubines, so that they could drink out of what was reserved for only God alone. Now, historically, there is absolutely no reason for Belshazzar to do this. Conquering kings would often do things like this in order to instill fear in the people that they had just conquered. You think your gods are powerful? Watch me drink out of your gods' cups. But the Jews had been conquered by the Babylonians for many years at that point. There was no threat of them overthrowing the Babylonians. And the only purpose for Belshazzar to call for the things from the temple of God was to raise himself up to the level of God. But in that same hour, while all that was going on, the fingers of a man's hands appears, and they write the judgment of Belshazzar on the wall of the king's palace. And it says that Belshazzar's hips were loosened and his knees knocked together, which I'd be pretty freaked out too. If I was in a situation where I had just called for all of the furniture from the temple of God to be brought to me, that I was asking for the wine goblets from the temple of God made out of gold so that I could drink out of them, that which was reserved for God alone, so that I could raise myself up to the level of God and mock him. If, in that situation, a giant hand appears and writes my judgment on the wall, I'd be pretty freaked out too. The only problem is that he had no idea what the judgment was, which I'd still be freaked out even if I didn't know what it said, because that's pretty weird. A hand appears and writes something on the wall. So he calls for his wise men, the Chaldeans, and all the soothsayers, and he offers the third highest position in the kingdom to whomever could read and interpret the writing. Now, this is also like another ironic, historical fact, is that he offers the third position in the kingdom, which means that Belshazzar himself only had the second position. He's not even the king. I mean, he is the king, but he's not the king. He's like a king in the place of the king while the king's away. You know, it's like when mom and dad go out of the house and the kids say, now it's time to party. That's Belshazzar. So he is the king, but he's not like the highest level king. He's like second tier king. And so he says, if anybody can interpret what this judgment is, then I will give you a third of the kingdom. And none of them can do it until the queen reminds him that in the days of Nebuchadnezzar, there was the great prophet Daniel that unlocked all of the mysteries of God for King Nebuchadnezzar. And so King Nebuchadnezzar, starting in verse 13, calls for Daniel. It says in verse 13, then Daniel was brought in before the king, and the king spoke and said to Daniel, are you that Daniel who is one of the captives from Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah? I have heard of you that the Spirit of God is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. Now the wise men and the astrologers have been brought in before me that they should read this writing and make known to me its interpretation, but they could not give the interpretation of the thing. And I have heard you that you give interpretations and explain enigmas. And now if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, let your gifts be for yourself and give your rewards to another, yet I will read the writing to the king and to make known to him the interpretation. Which at this point, God had probably already revealed the meaning, which is ironic. I'll give you a third of the kingdom. And Daniel's like, yeah, probably not worth much. O king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father a kingdom and majesty, glory and honor. And because of the majesty that he gave him, all the peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. And whomever he wished, he executed. Whomever he wished, he kept alive. Whomever he wished, he set up. And whomever he wished, he put down. But when his heart was lifted up and his spirit was hardened in pride, he who deposed him from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. Then he was driven from the sons of men, and his heart was made like the beasts, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. They fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God rules in the kingdom of heaven and appoints over it whomever he chooses. But you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, although you knew all this. and you have lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven. They have brought the vessel of his house before you, and you and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have drunk from the wine from them, and you have praised the gods of silver and gold and iron and bronze and wood and stone, which do not see or hear or know. And the God who holds your breath in his hand and owns all your ways you have not glorified. And then the fingers of the hands were sent from him, and his writing was written. And this is the inscription that was written. Mene, mene, tekel upharsin. And this is the interpretation. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Then Belshazzar gave the commands, and they clothed Daniel with purple and put a chain of gold around his neck and made a proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. And that very night, Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, was slain, and Darius the Mede was received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. So Belshazzar then sends for Daniel, brings him and offers him all these dazzling gifts of power that really had no meaning. And Daniel knew that they had no meaning. And Daniel is in the same camp as all the other true prophets that came before him. Instead of telling Belshazzar what he wants to hear, he offers Belshazzar the truth. And in addition to offering him truth, he offers him the historical context, which Belshazzar already knew. It's like, hey, Belshazzar, remember Nebuchadnezzar? Remember how God humbled him? Remember how Nebuchadnezzar learned? Now look at yourself and consider the fact that you did not learn everything that God communicated to the Babylonians through Nebuchadnezzar and through his prophet Daniel. And yet you have exalted yourself and made yourself and given yourself majesty above all peoples and languages, and you've trembled and you've caused them to fear you, and you have exalted yourself in a very similar way that Nebuchadnezzar did, but you've even gone beyond that and sought to make yourself out to be like God. And even though Nebuchadnezzar in all of his pride was eventually humbled, you have dug your heels in, which makes what you have done that much more reprehensible. And so Daniel, the D's. Daniel, when he comes, it's like a machine gun rattling off judgment to Belshazzar. He says, you have not humbled your heart, although you already knew the lessons of Nebuchadnezzar. You have lifted yourself up against God. You have defiled the vessels of the Lord's house. You and your lords, your wives, and your concubines. You have rejected God in favor of gods of silver, gold, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. You have not glorified God, who holds your breath in his hands. And with each of these words, the Belshazzar's guilt became more obvious and more great. There is no shifting the blame when it comes to Belshazzar. There is no way that Belshazzar can say, no, it was some other situation, some other circumstance. There is no way, like Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar was a pagan who did not know the God of Israel and thought that the God of Israel was weak because he conquered the Israelites. Well, God taught Nebuchadnezzar the lesson. Nebuchadnezzar learned. Belshazzar did not. And so Daniel then interprets the writing on the wall for him. God has numbered your kingdom. You've been weighed in the balances, and your kingdom will fall into the hands of the Medes and the Persians. In other words, Belshazzar, God has weighed your kingdom's morality and found it wanting. Therefore, I'm bringing your party to a close. Now, at this point, I think that Belshazzar's party mood was effectively cut short. The party was over. It was too late for Belshazzar. The judgment has been pronounced. Not only that, but probably as Daniel was speaking those words, the Medes and the Persians were sneaking under the wall, preparing for their attack. There is no attempt to repent from Belshazzar, and therefore the conclusion of this chapter is that night Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, was slain. And so as suddenly as he appeared in the historical record, he disappears. And the only record of Belshazzar the Great is that he was defeated in one night. Now, what is the message for us? The message for us, one thing we have to ask ourselves is, why was God so patient with Nebuchadnezzar but so seemingly abrupt with Belshazzar? I think there's several reasons. One, I think Belshazzar blatantly disregarded his responsibilities as a ruler. There's kind of no way that he didn't know that the Medes and Persians were on their way. But yet, his response to that was, you know what? I'm confident in our walls. I'm confident in our reserves. I'm confident that we can survive a siege. I'm confident in how great of a king I am. Therefore, instead of defending ourselves, let's throw a party in my honor and declare me to be God. Meanwhile, the Persians, the Medes and the Persians, were doing something that Belshazzar never would have imagined. They were diverting their water supply and using their water supply as a way to go under the walls and into the city. Belshazzar blatantly disregarded his responsibility as a ruler. Belshazzar expressed his pride in specific and pointed blasphemy by bringing the things from the temple of God and using them for himself. And Belshazzar had allowed his heart to become so deceived and so blinded by his own pride and his own sin that he literally lost touch with reality. Again, he is the perfect definition of a fool. Proverbs 18:12 says, "Before destruction, the heart of a man is haughty, and before honor is humility." And so Belshazzar is the perfect illustration of what it is to be a fool. He's the perfect illustration of what it is to know the lessons that God has taught and to blatantly disregard them. To disregard one's responsibility before God and trying to live independently from God, Belshazzar blasphemed God. And Belshazzar's story is a warning that mankind ought not dare to presume upon the patience and the grace of God. Which brings us back to Matthew and where we currently are in our study in the book of Matthew. Is there anybody in the book of Matthew that falls into the same category as Belshazzar? And the answer would be the religious leaders in Jerusalem. That by this point, they had claimed the religion that God had gifted to the people of Israel as a blessing, and they had taken it for themselves and raised themselves up to a position where they were almost infallible, where they and not God had all the power. And what was designed to bring God glory, they only used in order to glorify themselves. And they set themselves up in a place where they became a part of the kingdom of man that the chief cornerstone, hewn out not with human hands, would come and destroy. And in the next few weeks, as we continue in our study of the book of Matthew, the religious leaders will lift themselves up and not just bring the things from the temple of God, but they will bring God himself to trial. They will declare power over him, and they will kill him. Sort of. In the fact that Jesus says, "No one kills me, but I lay down my life." But the warning is still exactly the same. When God lays out the lesson, it is in our best interest to learn the lesson, to make it a part of our life, to put it into practice, and to do it. Nebuchadnezzar was dealt with patience because Nebuchadnezzar did not know any better. He was a pagan king who conquered the Israelites and then thought to himself, well, their God must not be that great. God communicated to Nebuchadnezzar, no, I am great. It's just that the Israelites never obeyed me. Nebuchadnezzar learns the lesson. Belshazzar ignored the lesson. The religious leaders in Jerusalem, they knew the lesson. They had been taught it many, many times. They themselves bore witness that they thought they learned the lesson. Jesus brought to their attention and said to them, guys, recognize the pattern here. God keeps sending his prophets and you keep killing them. And their response was, woe to our fathers. But we weren't there. And then they proceed to kill Jesus himself. They refused to learn the lesson. So the question for us is, what is God trying to communicate to us? And will we learn the lesson?